Good evening. Welcome to DiversiTV, Season 2, Show 2. Tonight we'll be looking at one section of an Anglo perspective. Neither Patsy or I or any of our guests would ever claim to represent the entire people, but to begin with our, if you go to slide, our DiversiTV mission, for those of you just catching up with us, is to illuminate everyday diversity issues as defined by Lane Community College and to give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. This is our Season 2 schedule. Last week we had the Native perspective with Gifford Talmadge of the Cherokee Nation. Today it's the Anglo perspective. Next week will be Africans in America, Latino, October 24th. Halloween night, Asian, November 7th, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, queer, questioning, two-spirit, etc., etc. November 14th, disability, youth, November 21st, class, and December 5th, our last show, spirituality and religion. Last season's Anglo perspective, we had a panel of three, Ruth Wren, Tim McMahon, and Chris Cullinan, talking about answering various questions about what would a non-racist, non-sexist, non-homophobic, egalitarian white culture look like, and beginning to answer those questions. And we visited lifting the white man's burden and also visited Peg McIntosh's concept of white privilege or white male privilege in her work from the 80s, unpacking the invisible knapsack without recapping that entirely. Part of her work that came out of the extension of that was, if we look at going to slide, the white man's burden from the Rudyard Kipling poem and this cool graphic that went with it. And if you can see this, what it is you have a U.S., probably a caricature of Teddy Roosevelt, because this is basically the time period. And he's carrying the stereotypical black savage, you know, in a grass skirt, big lips and all that, carrying him up the hill to the U.S. schoolhouse, which of course is, you know, the American flag. And the poem basically is essentially describing, you know, the supposed responsibility of whites to civilize the non-white peoples of the world. And so today, in preparation for our guest, I kind of decided, well, what if there was if there's a white man's burden, is there a white woman's burden besides the white man, right? Would that exist? You know, because that the saying about behind every successful woman is herself, and or behind every successful man is a woman rolling her eyes, right. Whatever. Yeah. So I did Google on the white woman's burden, and I found this piece written by Wendy McElroy in '03. And to quote her, I must lay down the, quote, white woman's burden. This is the feminist version of the white man's burden, a theory that was used to justify colonialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In essence, the theory said that white people had a moral obligation to civilize brown people. The Rudyard Kipling poem in which the term originated was written to justify the British colonization of India. Western feminists seem to believe they have a moral obligation to save the Arab Muslim woman by molding her into their own image. But if the oppression of Arab Muslim women results from local traditions and not from religion or ethnicity, then it is possible to respect Islam and Arabs without disrespecting her. By abandoning the assumption of superiority, Western feminists can say to the Arab Muslim woman, quote, we don't disparage your religion or your ethnic origins, we only want you to have choice. To continue with Peg McIntosh's continental worldview metaphor and the view of many feminists of color, so, you know, in my conversations with Patsy, we were talking about my mom, who basically considered herself a feminist, but basically said, well, it's not the women's movement, it's the white women's movement, because black women aren't so much concerned with reproductive rights. We have no problem reproducing children. We're more concerned with having our children not be killed by the police or put in jail in the prison industrial complex or even surviving.
Exactly.
So it's a different set of issues where that often, because of the extension of white privilege, people don't have to worry about survival type issues, and so their foci become different.
Right.
Peg's had this continental worldview metaphor, if you go back to the graphic, and she talked about the French word salient, which refers to mountains viewed from a plain. So, and applied to Western culture, she was saying the 5 mountains that make up Western civilization: the military, government, church, education, business, and you climb those mountains by scaling the ladders of success. And so the rules for success and who gets to the top of those mountains usually tends to be male, usually or women who tend to adopt the cultural values of men. These 5 things create mainstream culture and therefore shape and validate what a minority culture will look like, usually a mirror of the majority culture, or we're expected to conform to that. So in graphic form, you have those mountains: the church, education, business, military, government. They create mainstream culture, and if there is a counterculture, it basically deviates from the mainstream, but it basically is watered by the mainstream, so it's still essentially a white culture.
It's replicating.
It's replicating, you know. The coffee table book my father gave me, you know, because, you know, he said, well, you're a black hippie, but, you know, notice who's a hippie. And I said, okay, well, me, Jimi Hendrix, and Richie Havens, all the black people in your book. You're right, it's a white thing, okay, right?
Right.
But then you have the, you know, the minority culture, which the counterculture can borrow from, but essentially still becomes a part or separate. So Peg is basically suggesting that different worldviews might have different salient values forming on different continents. So Patsy, just to get into it here, she's an instructor with a women's studies program here at Lane and also coordinator and workforce development. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
In our conversation, we talked about the Combahee River collective statement that a lot of people weren't aware of, the referent.
Yes.
And that one of the things that if you're going to begin looking at this question of cultural competency, even if that you limit that definition to knowing the rules about how to deal with particular people from an outside point of view, then one of the rules you would notice about, for example, quote-unquote black feminists, right, is there's history. You have to understand the history. And Combahee River refers to a military campaign in which Harriet Tubman was in fact the general. In fact, that is actually where her nickname, the General, comes from, that military battle where she was the military commander and actually wound up freeing more slaves than she did in all her time in the Underground Railroad in a single week. But most people don't hear about that.
No.
So this collective of black women in Boston essentially, you know, named themselves and said, okay, we have to separate ourselves as black women, as black lesbians from the larger, for example, the corresponding movement in white feminism where you have lesbian separatists. Black women do not have the option of separating ourselves from black men because we're dealing with racism, we're dealing with issues of survival. And to just read a snippet from this, their position, if black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. Feminism is, nevertheless, very threatening to the majority of people because it calls into question some of the most basic assumptions about our existence. That is, that sex should be a determinant of power relationships. we feel that it is absolutely essential to demonstrate the reality of our politics to other black women and believe that we can do this through writing and distributing our work. Now, just the fact that most people aren't even aware of this, and that,
Right.
you know, when you say, you know, feminism, you know, we think of the 70s, bra burning, blah,
Yeah,
blah, blah,
right.
and men hating, all that kind of stuff. If there is a white woman's burden to be let down, can you describe it? And
Yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, I hadn't thought of it in those terms until, you know, I came just before the show and you said, you know, it just kind of popped into your mind. So you thought, I'll Google this and see what I find on this concept of, is there a white woman's burden? And I think certainly as a women's studies instructor, I mean, I've been teaching these classes since 1992. And it's clear that what comes up over and over again in these classrooms full of predominantly white young women, although here at LCC we often have a diversity in terms of range and background and class background and so forth, but still predominantly in any given class, the vast majority of students are white. Very well meaning, very well intended. I mean, these are classes that are not requirements of any degree program. They're electives, and so the joy of teaching those classes is people are there typically because they want to be, they're interested. Many of these young women at this point have themselves been raised by feminist moms who kind of came of age during the women's movement, and many of them raised by single mothers. So they have an intuitive feel of what they're interested in about women's studies and about women's lives in general. But still, what something we have to grapple with every single term is that basic bottom line notion of privilege, that basic bottom line awareness of the inheritance we all have as Americans of this notion in our national ethic of cultural superiority, the white man's burden, and there is a white woman's burden that's part of that, and it was very much part of the first wave of feminism in the 1800s, which is why there was a split even then in the women's movement between women of color and white women, at least some white women. Some white women saw right off that there had to be common cause or they were going to be defeated. But some white women were very attached to the notion of racial superiority, even bought into the tenets of the eugenics movement at that time. Yeah. And so feminism as a theoretical perspective, as a political ethos, in its development, has struggled always with these issues. And not just around issues of race. I mean, Betty Friedan very infamously stated, you know, in the 60s, that she was terribly afraid that what she called at that time the lavender menace would compromise. Yes, meaning lesbians. The inclusion of lesbians in the women's movement would compromise the women's movement being able to achieve its goals. Okay. I assume for all women, right. But of necessity, this particular group of women needed to be excluded. So it's part of it, and I think part of the roots of that comes out of the 60s women's movement. There was a very strong, it came out of kind of that liberal notion of rights, of equality of rights, equality of opportunity, and which makes a lot of sense to in a lot of white women's lives, because they're just looking at dealing with issues of gender, their relationships with men, patriarchy. But for women of color, those issues weren't the most pressing issues in their lives. And they had to make much more common cause with the men in their lives because of the legacy of racism in this country. So I think feminism has always struggled with, and feminists have always struggled with, that by merit of education, by merit of their social position, that early feminists did tend to be primarily white, and really bought into that notion of the civilizing impact that they as women could have, the bringing up other women in other circumstances to join in a civilized life. And how this plays out in a classroom like mine today, for instance, with these young, very earnest women, is, again, just when they turn in papers, they reflect on the readings and the text. I think I use a really good textbook that addresses a variety of experience, and it's challenging for them. They'll say things like, I couldn't really relate to this essay because that's not my experience. And I'm thinking, that's why you're supposed to be reading it and thinking about it and reflecting on it. Because the reason you can't relate to this woman's experience has a lot to do with the fact that you have been in a position of privilege so that these issues have not been in your life.
Give an example of that.
Well, you know, something like when we were talking the other day about this particular reading by the Black Feminist Collective. It was written in 1977, and I had one of the women who is very articulate, smart, bright, and very well intended. A little older than some of the other students, but she wrote in her journal that she really felt like it was a divisive essay, that it really stirred up and emphasized the divisions among women rather than how we can kind of pull together and work, you know, in each other's best interests. That she felt like white women in the women's movement were being called racist. And she took great issue with that. And, you know, to me, again, it was, number one, if reading that made her feel uncomfortable, then that's the moment that you really need to sit down and go, well, why? What's poking on me here? You know, why am I having this response? And it was clear that the notion that, I mean, again, from a position of privilege, it's like, why does racism have to even be brought up? We're supposed to be working together, right? And it's like you say, unless you understand the history, I mean, these women are talking to you. They're trying to say something to you important about their experience, you know, and about some of the differences and the divisions and the issues that did exist in the women's movement that still get grappled with. And if you blow those off, or if you say that's divisive and you don't grapple with those, there's no trust, there's no alliances that can be built, there's no real understanding of anyone else's situation and how that relates to your own privilege. So the issues of privilege are huge every term in class to grapple with. You know, they'll read essays from a completely different cultural perspective, for instance, that will really be talking, you know, maybe written by a Latina about her grandmother and the relationship in that family, and, you know, how the role of mother, grandmother is very revered, and, you know, and sometimes it's just like, well, you know, the assumption that, yeah, but those roles are also oppressive. And so, because maybe in her experience as a young white woman looking at her own family, that is how those roles were experienced. But the notion that in another cultural context, that those roles are central and essential to the strength also that women, you know, have, is a foreign concept. And so, you know, it's those lenses that we see things through that, I mean, every term I think, well, if we can just, like, by the end of 10 weeks, if they've kind of got a grip on the idea of privilege, you know, if they've got a grip on systems of oppression where they can get beyond thinking about things like racism and sexism and these kinds of things, classism, as bad behavior or as an individual issue that doesn't affect them, because that's often in their essays. You know, I judge everybody on the basis of who they are as a person. It upsets me to see people treated badly. You know, and when they write these things in their journal, I tell them, you know what? Please, give me something here.
Yeah.
You know, give me something we can really work with here, because these are vague generalities. I want you to dig deeper. And if you're feeling uncomfortable, you talk about that. That's what's interesting. And that's what's going to move us along. So, especially when we look at other cultures, and you know, these issues around Muslim culture, Arab culture, women in these cultures, it's always, you know, I'm really glad I live in this culture. I'm really glad that I don't have those issues to deal with. I really feel bad for those women. I really would like to figure out how we can help them. You know, and I can't fault them. It's well intended.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But it's really trying to shift that around a little bit. You know, I mean, that's what I think.
Responsibility, certainly.
Yeah.
And also the level of empowerment, too. Looking at, okay, pretending that the divides don't exist. And,
right.
Okay, well, there's structures supporting the divides, and are they useful and are they not? I mean, for example, just in their own roles, okay? And even though these classes are elective, what is going to be the result of their education? And in terms of, you know, assuming they're heterosexual, you know, that they're going to have a tactical advantage. I mean, there was a piece in the New York Times in the last couple of weeks about this problem with women who are educated, and that education leading to better paying jobs than the men, and have this being a problem in dating, where, you know, like in New York or San Francisco or LA, you know, a woman who's a lawyer, or, you know, we don't have to fight the battle of, you know, right. Are you going to be included in, you know, these previously male occupations?
Right.
But what it means is now your earning power is greater than a man, and, you know, wow, you know, picking up the check.
Yeah.
You know,
how's that going to impact your
right.
your relationships, your interactions, your household,
You know, and I've been seeing this, you know, even, you know, talking with, you know, young black women here who, you know, are basically getting an education and basically dealing with, you know, the stereotype is guys from the basketball team who are basically just, you know, okay, do you have anything to bring to me other than sex?
Right.
Do you have any brains?
Yeah.
Can you talk about?
Yeah, we're going to be able to have any kind of conversation afterward, at all,
yeah.
You know, even if we've had a good time, then what? You know, then where are we?
Right. Yeah, because assuming that you don't make it into the NBA, and I'm going to be...
Yeah. It's a very outside chance.
Yeah, and I'm going to be the breadwinner here. Are you going to be threatened by that? Is that going to threaten your concept of manhood? And, you know...
Well, you know, Wanda Coleman, who's like one of my favorite poets in the world, said, you know, black women in America are probably the loneliest people in the world, you know. And she's written a lot of powerful poetry around her experience as a single black woman raising particularly male children in this culture. But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, is it going to make them unfit for what lies ahead? You know, I mean, you know, it's really gratifying to see light bulbs go on, and light bulbs do go on with these young women. And I think that we really do, you know, it's like you say, when you take them off the farm and they see Paris, ain't no going back. Certainly true for me, you know, coming from Oklahoma. I mean, I was just thinking about this the other day, that I went to a high school. I graduated from high school in 1970. In Tulsa, Oklahoma. And, you know, the baby boom was sufficient that they were just building new high schools like mad at that time in the burbs, right? Tulsa was a very segregated city at that time. And so that high school that I went to was maybe just, 6 or 7 years old when I started there. It was huge. I mean, my graduating class had almost 900 people in it. And there was, it was all white. My graduating class, there was one black student, and his name was Brian White. And I thought, this is like a cosmic joke, you know. But, when I look at my own background, where I was raised and the issues I was raised around, the assumptions and stereotypes I was raised around in terms of other cultures, in terms of race and class, in terms of gender, you never know where you're going to end up, But I know that grappling with really difficult questions and grappling with really difficult issues was really crucial to the development of my thinking around any of this stuff. And so, I'm basically at the front of the classroom just trying to stir it up. I want to stir it up, and it's very gratifying to teach in that way, but I really do think that it's crucial what we're doing, especially at a place like the community college.
Yes. Where that's the mission, really.
Where that is the mission, and it is going to make an impact on these people's lives. It does, every day.
How do you see the intersection of transitions and workforce development where you are now?
Well, that's a good question, Mark. The intersect. See, I thought you were going to say something about the intersectionality of race and class.
Well, there is that. We can set that aside for a second, but okay, I wanted to bring it.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, number one, we share a lot of students. There's a lot of. I see a lot transitions. A lot of the women that go through our transitions program, which it's not just because I was part of it for a long time, but I really do think it's such a phenomenal program for any woman in any kind of transition, which basically covers all the bases. We see a lot of those women over in workforce because we have resources in our department, scholarships. We have money to supplement financial aid. If somebody doesn't qualify for financial aid, we've got some money for their education and training costs, child care, support service resources. And because we deal with, over in workforce, everyone we deal with has to be categorized as very interesting. To get our services, get our money, they got to fall into one of two categories. One is called dislocated workers, which we've been serving for a long time out at LCC. Since.
Is that dislocated homemaker too?
Well, yes, displaced homemakers can count in that category. Okay. So dislocated workers, one category. The other category is low-income adult. Okay. Well, we're LCC. I'd say, that pretty much covers the bases. Right. So a lot of the women that go through transitions have very limited resources. So this is another resource space for them as they progress through their academic and career goals. So I see that intersection. So I see a lot of those same issues. And then in my women's studies class, I end up seeing some of these same students. They'll start in transitions, which really does kind of start at looking, you really do some self-assessment and some dealing with the stuff that's kept you up to this point from really being able to move on in your life in ways that you want to. So, that can be grief and loss issues. It can be trauma of whatever kind from however long ago that you've never had the opportunity or the safe place to deal with. So there's a lot of internal work, but the way the curriculum is set up, it's really a setup to then be able, for that to be an empowering process, to be able to then go out and take that out into the world with you, with your family, with your children, in your relationships and beyond. And so I think the women's studies classes are a great follow-up to that.
Well, it would seem like they're ready, because I get a lot of clients in my program in terms of the prevention program, the recovery center, from transitions. Women who have been on the stroll in the sex industry, women who have been in the underground economy as, you know, shall we say, pharmaceutical providers.
Right, yes. Yeah.
And, you know, are basically getting retrained, you know, displaced homemakers who, you know, basically were in that and, you know, are now basically trying to get into the above ground legitimate economy through education, and have to be re-educated in a way that is empowering. Not so much climbing that ladder of success that we were talking about, but that is part of it, practically, because baby needs shoes.
That's
and,
right.
You know.
You need to at least know the vocabulary and what the rules and regs are, so that you, and then you can participate to whatever extent you want, but at least you're not shut out because you lack even knowing, you know, what the cachet is. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty, you know, our students here are grappling with so much stuff. It's pretty amazing, really, you know. I mean, I'll ask any particular class, okay, how many of you are full-time students, you know, okay? How many of you are also working a job? How many of you are working more than one? Okay, how many of you have your own families also, you know? And so I'm saying, well, you guys are triple shifters. You know, you got 3 full-time jobs. Let's see, you got 24 hours. So how do you do it?
Right.
And
how many of you are the first people to go to college, you know, in your family?
That's right, absolutely. I got a woman in my class this term who went through transitions. She's a single mom. She's got 8 kids, you know, and a pretty amazing and harrowing background experience to this point, you know. And to me, she's a hero. I mean, that she shows up every day, that she can manage. She has no vehicle. She gets out here on the bus. That she shows up, that she's here, and she's, you know, she's focused. And, you know, I don't care if you show up in your jammies. You know, you can, whatever. You had a bad day and you could not get all the kids out. Yeah. But we're not talking just the young dudes.
And bringing the kids, too.
Yeah, that's right. You know, just get up here any way you can. And you know, so it's amazing. A lot of our students, I really feel like, are heroes in terms of what they're...
Or heroines.
Or heroines, whatever.
That's
right. Yeah. Well, see, the hero's journey. The hero's journey is classically a male journey. So I like to call a hero's journey. Women can participate in hero's journey, you know. But the hero's journey really requires turning in, you know, and a real focus on what am I made of? What, you know, what am I capable of, you know, when called upon? And that's a real, that's a question I see a lot of our students haven't had to bump up against. A lot of the cultural markers and experiences that have provided that in the past are gone, you know, and so our opportunities, I mean, I think that's why a lot of young people, on top of, you know, they need money for college and they need to get out of the hood or whatever, sign up for, you know, and get shipped off to Iraq.
Military.
You know, it's like, I need to be tested. I need to see what, you know, I need to be called upon to do something and see what I'm made of.
Right.
And, you know, women participate in that journey too. And so, yeah, we got a lot of heroes walking around this campus, I think.
Are the cultural markers gone, or do they need to be rediscovered? Because
well,
I think, for example, I mean, the example that you just gave, because I was looking at, on one of my computers, I was mad about the war. And I was thinking about Lori Piesterwa. And so who Lori was, okay, she was the first person to die in Iraq. first soldier to die in Iraq, was a Hopi,
Native
yes,
woman.
a Hopi woman, okay? Single mom, you know, from Arizona. And one of the things in terms of, you know, like really doing this work, you really have to look at the history. So the Hopi do not have a warrior tradition. The Hopis traditionally do not fight.
Right.
They're protected by everybody else around them because their role is basically to hold the spiritual heart of the mother. That's their job. And that's why everybody, you know, recognizes that and protects them. And so the irony of a Hopi woman being the first person to die in Iraq, right, for a country that probably does not really recognize Hopi sovereignty. And so the first thing, she's a Hopi mom from a non-warrior tradition. Basically, I'm going to make the assumption here, and it's a classist assumption, but that she didn't join the military because, you know, really that she joined it out of survival issues, right? Yeah. Either the lure of college or whatever. Now, a lot of people will try and play, well, you know, it's an honor for her to die for her country, yada, yada, yada. But no, there's another piece. She's basically abandoning the mores of her culture to do this and not necessarily being honored. Yes, she gave her life for America, et cetera, but what about the kids? You know, and are those kids going to be taken up by, supported by America in that same way? And, you know, what are the roles? What are the roles? What are their options? And how do we honor that? And how are women going to be entered into that? Because then when we look at, you know, the whole Suzanne Swift case, you know, being immortalized in Doonesbury, where, you know, here you have a woman, you know, being subject to sexual assault by her superiors and all these other kinds of things, suffering all these kind of wounding, right? What is she going to be drawing on?
Wounding, you know, not by strangers in the bushes or, you know, whatever, the classic stereotypical boogeymen around sexual assault, but by her brothers in arms, by those with whom she's supposed to have the strongest bond, to have each other's back and all that. I mean, that kind of betrayal trauma is the hardest, is the toughest. You know, anybody that's suffered that kind of assault will tell you that, you know, that suffering that kind of experience at the hands of someone who either, you know, claims to love you or who with whom you're supposed to be strong allies, be able to trust each other, back each other up, is pretty wounding. It's pretty wounding. And yeah, well, you know, I was reading a rather lengthy article the other day about Native women and sexual assault, and you know, again, it's an issue of, I mean, sexual assault. You know, the extent to which it doesn't really get pursued on any level, but for Native women, it really goes back to, you know, who is considered worthy. Who is considered worthy enough to really merit, you know, responding to when they've been violated, whatever level. And so, you know, the rates of sexual assault, the extent to which it's not even investigated at all, let alone any sorts of legal ramifications, are epidemic for Native women. You know, it's another issue. There's cultural factors there. There's, you know, this is not an issue that that can just be looked at, you know, broadly without recognizing the different ways that different groups of women, you know, are impacted by these issues. And, you know, even in my native state, in Oklahoma, it's such a huge issue. They've got some great organizations that are really trying to, of Native women that are trying to work on this, but, you know, it's a huge issue. that we still haven't dealt with after all this time.
Yeah.
You know, and you think of what was that video game that was very popular, Custer's Revenge. Oh my Lord! You know, in the face of the reality,
right.
you know, that hurts.
Yeah, well, Custer's Revenge, or even looking at a feminist analysis of something like Grand Theft Auto. You know, when I think about, what we've been talking about in terms of looking at, because my next question was, what would an inclusive feminism look like in the 21st century? Mm-hmm. We're beyond bra burning here. It's like
a way.
quite a ways. I mean, we're not fighting the battle of, like you were talking about with, Betty Friedan talking about, the lavender menace. We're not fighting that inclusion anymore.
Right.
But we are looking at, in terms of other issues around survival, in terms of looking at the divides of race and class and sexual orientation and all those other kind of things. So it does seem to be inclusive and also really grounded in the practical.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Where else do you think it needs to go that it hasn't?
Well, there's certainly, we talk about globalization, kind of the impacts of globalization in my class a lot, and there's a lot of downsides with which we're all familiar. But I think one of the positive sides, and I would include positive impacts on feminism, is a notion of the extent to which we have so much more access to information about what women around the world are doing.
Right.
At a grassroots level or even at larger levels in their own communities, to really enact change and to confront unjust authority, whatever colonial authority or whatever neo-colonial authority, local patriarchal authority. And, so I think at this point we have, speaking as, whatever, white feminist in this country, I really feel like I have so much, it's so rich in terms of so much to learn and incorporate, from these efforts of women around the world who are living in circumstances very different from our own, whose histories are so different. And so I think that, feminism is in development. I mean, every term my students say, well, define feminism, and they seem to have this idea that there is a definition, there is a, something, a
there
feminist. Well, there's lots of different definitions,
Okay, what's yours?
Mine is, looking at women's self-determination.
Okay.
But, women's self-determination cannot be viewed over here under this petri dish in isolation from, other forms of oppression. I mean, it's all part of, but it's to what extent are women able to act, as social actors with agency? Mm-hmm. And, I think those are issues that then can be broadly interpreted in almost any cultural context. With, for instance, you mentioned reproductive rights issues, yes. And somebody that I actually went to Portland last night to hear speak and see a photo exhibit that she helped curate, and it's a pretty fabulous. She's an historian, but she's an independent historian. She's an independent scholar. She's not attached to any academic institution.
Sometimes the best kind.
Sometimes the best kind. And her name is Ricky Solinger, and she's pretty much devoted most of her life as an historian. She's an activist and a historian, and she's devoted most of it to really looking at these issues of reproductive, what she calls reproductive justice. And she says, you cannot look at it that it is so centrally bound up with issues of race. absolutely. Race and class. And so, you know, I think that, you know, if we look at, you know, people that are working on the issues of the unbelievable percentage of our population that are incarcerated in this country,
Yes.
and you look at what those people behind bars, men and women, look like, and, you know, people that want to work on those issues, and you look at, okay, how many of the women behind bars, because women have been the exponential growth in women's incarceration rates since the beginning of the war on drugs in the 80s. How many of them had children?
Right.
What happens with the children?
Being raised in foster care with,
Yeah, you know, and so, but yeah, for lots of, for women of color, the whole reproductive rights issue was never really about the right, you know,
to have children.
The right, right, the right, or the right to not have children by
Right.
access to contraception or to abortion, but issues of, well, what happens when we have children and they're taken away from us?
Right. And why are they taken away from us?
Who is considered to be a legitimate mother? You know, Ricky Solinger says it's all about race and class.
Yes.
You know, that motherhood has become like an economic, is motherhood an economic status? Because even in my classes, I'll hear young women say, well, you know, if I don't believe that women, you know, if they're single moms or they're poor, you know, they shouldn't be having more kids if they can't support them. So
I see.
yeah. So then is motherhood now it's an economic status then? You should only have children if you can
Apparently.
afford them? It's not an effective affective relationship?
Right. And then again, if your kids get taken away, then who is the state going to be, you know, is the care that is given to a child of color the same care that's going to be given to a white child in that system?
Well,
There's the hair thing, there's, you know, history, culture, there's
yeah, and we have such a phenomenal foster system, you know.
indeed.
Yeah, that we want to put more children there. So, you know, whatever, you know, I think there's a lot of areas of growing interest that have really broadened in terms of the perspective on these things that I think really have a lot of potential for people to, you know, for people to take a feminist analysis that's much more informed, much more grounded in a fuller understanding of, you know, how central it is to include, especially issues of race and class, when you're looking at any of these issues. And I think we're doing that a lot more than we have before, you know, but it's still, like I say, you know, every term, it's like still a lot of those kind of just taken for granted notions that are part of this kind of white woman's burden, you know? How to help them over there.
Further down in that Google, when I did Google white woman's burden,
Right.
and besides McElroy's article, there were a couple of, well, I found them humorous. You would find them humorous too, where basically the white woman's burden was actually from, I guess there's no gentle way to say this, so the white woman's burden is to keep having more white babies because the white race is getting, you know, depopulated relative to, you know, people of color, and, you know, America is becoming a quasi-brown nation, and it's up to the white women to have white babies.
Oh, yeah, that is another white woman's burden. You're
Right.
It's been a white woman's burden in
And
the past.
there were sites that were parodying that, basically saying, look, you know, I mean, when you have the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Florida basically saying that lesbian Jew nurses, there we go, there's the, you know, lavender men. Lesbian Jew nurses are killing white babies, and that's why we have to bomb abortion clinics and kill abortion doctors because...
Oh, my head is hurting trying to keep up with that one.
Yeah, right. Right,
okay.
lesbian Jew nurses. Okay, so how do you know? And, well, right, well, it's the Klan. So we're expecting logic from them. No, okay, but all right.
Not so much.
You're afraid that, okay, America is not going to be a white country anymore because of illegal immigration, or, you know, these people, or these brown people are having more babies, having too many babies, and...
Yeah, like Solinger said, you know, everybody assumes, you know, and certainly Reagan really trafficked in this, that whole welfare queen
mom,
thing.
welfare
you
queen
know,
thing, yeah.
And she says, okay, how many children on average does, you know, a black woman on welfare? Well, we don't have welfare anymore. We've done away with that.
Yes.
But, you know, a black woman on
reformed it, yes.
Yeah, we've deformed it,
Deformed
done
it.
away with it. How many children? 1.8 children. 1.8. I'm always interested in the 0.8 child. But anyway, 1.8 children. She said it's a complete myth, you know. And beyond that, people thinking for some odd reason, and you know, as she says, anyway, her stuff is so interesting, that whole history of how even the whole system of public assistance, what came to be known as welfare, who were considered women worthy of receiving that assistance, who weren't, you know, who was able to be included in getting widows' benefits, in receiving public assistance. Well, you know, if you worked in, there were certain areas that if you worked in, you didn't qualify for that assistance, you know, in the 30s when the legislation was passed. If you worked in agriculture or if you were a domestic. The vast majority of black women at that time in this country working in one or the other of those fields, completely unable to access that national resource structure.
Because of segregated education or whatever. So if that segregation were going to continue, and not that we have time to deconstruct that in the less than 5 minutes remaining to us.
Yes, well.
My, how time flies. I guess looking to the present and to the future, what can be done in terms of shifting the let's say that Hillary becomes president.
They're having a discussion about that this very evening, I believe,
yes,
down at United Methodist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hillary becomes president.
Okay.
And then it becomes a national security issue that every child is clothed, fed, educated, given reproductive health, access to health care.
Yeah.
I mean, that becomes an interesting, you know, I mean, is Hillary a feminist? Would you consider Hillary a feminist?
Oh, God, you would have to ask stuff like that, wouldn't you, Mark? You were down the last 5 minutes. We could have passed on that one. Oh, I'm sure Hillary is a feminist. I'm sure she counts herself as a feminist. And I don't know. I would say she is, too. You know, I have issues with her politically, but I think that, I mean, I've just been interested in the response of people nationally to even the notion of would you even vote for a female?
Yeah.
And it's kind of scary, some of those responses. So that's a whole interesting issue, and I've been really fascinated in watching how they're kind of positioning her. You know, she can't be, you know, she's got to kind of cling to her position on the war because we don't want some, you know, soft soap, you know, namby-pamby woman that's too soft on these issues. But, you know, militarism is directly connected to the fact, you know, the giant sucking sound over there is draining our national resources so that, you know, everything is getting defunded that provides our infrastructure for all these issues you're talking about. So we'll see if Hillary comes through. Interesting question.
I guess my issue with Hillary, you know, if I were going to say, you know, my issue with Obama, he's not Mandela enough.
Yep.
It's not about black enough. It's not Mandela enough. And my issue with Hillary, she's not Harriet Tubman enough.
Absolutely.
Okay? Because we don't need, you know, another, you know, good old boy in skirts. Sorry, we don't.
Yeah.
We need, We need the consciousness of a Harriet Tubman, able to be not only a strong military leader, but also, look, we need freedom, okay? And we need to, if this is the land of the free, then we need more people to be free. And somebody with the, I believe the Spanish term is huevos, to pull it off.
The huevos. Okay. All right. Well, she doesn't have
the
those.
Eggs. Well, she does.
Well, she does.
She
Yeah,
does.
okay.
She does.
But, well, yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, both of them can only go as far as the Democratic National Committee lets them go.
Final thoughts.
Yeah, final thoughts.
Yeah.
Well, it's been fun.
Yeah.
It's been great. And, yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm actually hopeful because teaching and having the youngins in the classroom there, there's so much energy, and like I say, there is good intention. There's heart there, and there's passion, you know. And so to me, that's a great opportunity, and it gives me a lot of hope, which we need in these days and times, let's face it.
Yes. So we've had Patsy Raney. This has been DiversiTV. And tune in next week when we will have Danoa from the U of O Ethnic Studies talking about the African American experience in Eugene. And thank you for watching.